In this episode, we discuss the 2023 documentary Join or Die, which is currently airing on Netflix, and takes a look at the surprising importance of participating in clubs or groups and social groups and activities in maintaining a democratic society, and how the decline in community engagement may have us all on the edge of disaster. Hello, welcome to the Call Like I See It podcast. I'm James Keys, and joining me today is a man who's always ready to hit you with some surprising content. Tunde Ogunlana. Tunde, are you ready to show us your grand national experimental today?
Yes, only today.
Okay. only today.
Not tomorrow.
Yeah, for sure. Now, before we get started, if you enjoy the show, we ask that you subscribe and hit like and so forth on YouTube or your podcast app. Doing so really helps the show out. We're recording on November 26, 2024, and we continue our Streaming Between the Lines series today and take a look at the documentary film Join or Die, which started streaming this fall in Netflix, although it was created in 2023. It's directed by Pete and Rebecca Davis, and Join or Die introduces us to Robert, or Bob, as they refer to him a lot of times, Putnam, and his findings on how important people's participation in social clubs and activities and groups collectively, how important that is to maintaining a healthy democratic society, and how Americans in mid-20th century America had very high levels of this, and also how the big decline that's been observed over the past few decades, it must be reversed, or we die, if you follow the hyperbole of the title of the documentary. So Tunde, what stood out to you most in the film? Join or Die, and in Bob Putnam's research, into this idea that being involved in groups and clubs and what would he had the book, Bowling Alone, talking about bowling leagues and how that stuff is really good for the health of a person and the health of a nation.
Yeah. No, I mean, there's several things that stood out, which I know we'll discuss today. But I think that the biggest thing for me was this idea and the concept of what he called social capital, which, he didn't invent, which he rightfully admitted. It had been used prior to his use of it. But this idea that, in the way that I understood it, is like social capital is kind of the glue that has been unrecognized, I think, by academia and by kind of just our society as a whole. But it's something that it's like the fact that it's been diminishing. I think most of us, especially people, let's say over a certain age, let's say over 35 or 40 that have been around long enough to experience some of the changes. It's like something we can all feel. And once it's explained to you in a way that the documentary explained it, in terms of social capital, this idea of human connections as, let's say, manifested in our societies, let's say in the last 100, 200 years, in maybe social groups, clubs, organizations, things like that, the diminishing of that environment and that ecosystem for us as individuals at the interpersonal level is something that we all kind of, I think, feel. It's this uneasy feeling that most of us have in our society, but we haven't been able to put a word or kind of like identify it. And I feel like that was the biggest thing for me out of the documentary, was the identification of social capital as actual capital, just like, infrastructure.
Putting in
capital.
That frame.
Yeah.
That frame of because that's an economic concept that we're familiar with, but putting it in the frame of, that's good. I mean, to me, man, this was very eye-opening for me, because I never realized or looked at joining a club as being something more than just, like an individual type of thing. Like for me right now, I'm involved in a lot of little league stuff with my kids, but I never looked at that in the context of a civil type of thing. I could see it was good for my kids and development and socialization and learning how to compete and learning how to play and win and lose and all these kind of skills that are very helpful for a developing person. But I never realized, just in the documentary talks about, the Rotary Club and Kiwanis and all things like signs I've seen driving around, cities and towns, but I never looked at those as it's just, that's something that I guess people do, or people have done. So I never thought of it as something more, something as part of like a civic type of thing that you could be doing, that's a part of your engagement with the community that has effects beyond just, oh, well, that's for you if you move to a new town and don't have any friends, then that's a good way to go meet people or something like that. But beyond any of that, it can be something more than that. And there was a fundamental question, I think, that was raised in the documentary, and talking about like, well, this is what we're doing here in terms of a society, a government of the people type of thing, like a thing where we're not here because we're forced to be here. And are we all in this together? Are we doing this, this community together, or this city together, or this state together? Are we trying to collectively solve our problems, through democratic means and so forth? Or are we all just kind of lone wolfing it, going it alone, passing each other in the hallway, but, like it's not a collective enterprise? And I think that right now we have drifted into the space where many of us look at this kind of like we're all individuals, operating, we're all planets circling a solar system, but we're not part of the same dance, so to speak. And, that's difficult because, we're in a multiracial democracy, which not only hasn't really been done, but hasn't really even been tried before in history. And so how can the question specifically that was asked was, how can we feel like and behave like we're part of a larger community and a larger project if we don't all look the same? Which apparently, if you look throughout time, it's easier to do that then. And this is the type of thing that has been able to do that. And if you look at multiracial, but you can go back in history, and then this was a multi-ethnic, multinational democracy before even all of the racial aspects of it were able to even get onto the same level, from a legal standpoint. And so it was the Irish and the Italians and the British and all these people that in the old country might not have been cool, but were able to come here and be able to put something together and build something together collectively. And you see the kind of mechanisms that would do that, because it doesn't happen on its own. And I'll kick it back. But one other thing I'll say, what was specifically mentioned was that you can design the best governmental system in the world. You could design just the greatest system, but that itself won't get you all the way there. You need more. You need buy-in. As with anything, I think of, I always think of sports teams with this type of thing. And it's like, you need buy-in. You have the greatest schemes or whatever, but you need people to buy in to each other and to what everybody's trying to do collectively in order for you to get at least the sum of the parts, and a lot of times if you get a lot of that, you can get more than the sum of the parts.
Yeah, and I think I want to come back to what you alluded to near the end of your statements there about the governmental side, because I think we should definitely discuss his studies from his time in Italy. I think that was pretty interesting. But just to finish up where you were on before that is really the idea of a story, and like you're saying, what you're talking about is a shared story. And I've come to appreciate that more and more just through the things we've discussed on the show and other learning I've done. And I mean, we've talked about a lot of things even in the history of our show, like, let's say, The Lost Cause, right? It was a story about the Civil War. And, you and I, from a cultural perspective, may have been on, let's say, the tribe that was on the losing end of that discussion, right? The real story about the South, slavery.
Yeah, that kind of retelling of history.
And the success of Reconstruction and the lies that were told about it afterwards. Unfortunately, what I realize now is that as much as you and I culturally may have been not on the good receiving end of that agreement, let's say culturally, of the country saying, this is a story we'll agree to and let's move forward. The reality is, at the time, that probably was necessary for the country not to actually fracture and become two countries. And it's the same what I've learned to appreciate religion more, that it's not necessarily about taking it literally, but religion was necessary for large groups of humans to do things together, like build pyramids and build cathedrals in the Middle Ages and all that stuff. So the point, back to the documentary, he makes the point that half of group activities, social activities and volunteering, half of it is religious based, now, or historically through, or just a story,
so
right?
Like those are great ways. Well, the story piece is like more nexus, though, in terms of the actual.
No, but what I mean is like
together.
But the Kiwanis clubs, the Rotary clubs, all that. Like, I'm a member of a Masonic lodge, and what I realized in watching the documentary, because they showed a little bit of a lodge activity, what you learn in those organizations is how to behave. And I don't mean that as a joke. What I mean is I feel like we saw it after COVID with all the videos about Karens in the airport and all this stuff. Like people have forgotten how to behave socially in public with other people. And when you're a member of these organizations, whether it's Rotary, Kiwanis, Masons, your church, whatever it is, there's a certain way of behaving in these organizations. There's a certain hierarchy. There's leadership. There's people that are in the flock. There's a certain relationship between leadership and the flock, and there's rules of engagement within those organizations that loosely mirror the kind of rules of engagement of our greater society. So I think that by having these smaller micro societies, let's call them, if we can call them that, the collective, most of us, and you use this term well in a lot of discussions, the critical mass of our population generally has an understanding of how to behave with others. And I feel like what I realized with this social capital stuff and this documentary, and then also our experiences, let's say through the pandemic and post-pandemic, is we've lost that. This hyper, and they talked about it a bit, this hyper individualism culture paired with social media and the internet. And then I think the final nail in the coffin was the pandemic, just forcing people into isolation. Coming out of that isn't that easy for us. Most people still want to be like alone, and they found now a community online which is artificial, right? It's not the real thing.
It mimics some pieces of it, but it doesn't provide
not the whole thing.
I that stood out to me as well, though, the piece about how teaching you how to behave, because there are several ways you can look at being a member of a group in this context as being beneficial to you individually and to the people around you, so to speak. One they talked about is just strength in numbers and strength in organizing people and numbers of people. You can get things done, like whether it be in any kind of society, just you by yourself. Animals, predators hunt in groups, like a lot of times. And so you can just get more done if there's more people working together. And so the strength in numbers, the strength in the organization of those numbers, but also the piece of the practice, like I said, for me, I get my kids involved in things. And the point of that is it's very intentional. And it's like, okay, I want to make sure that they're socialized in a way in terms of how to interact, how to deal when you have, when you have the bully in the group, and how to, okay, well, you need to then have your own group, that makes you guys not a target of that. And or just different things like that. Or when you don't get your way, how to behave, how to go about that. And so I look at that as lessons that you got to learn as a kid. What I didn't think about until I was seeing this was that, okay, well, those are things you have to practice ongoing in your life. It's not like you learn it and then you just have it. And then that's just it. Those things you can get out of practice with that. You can get those muscles can get atrophied as far as, okay, well, and that's, I think, what we did see with the pandemic or with January 6th or anything like that. It's like, okay, well, I didn't get my way. Well, I can't just be cool about that and figure out, okay, in the next round, I'm going to do something about this. Like, no, I got to go, if it's pandemic, I got to go hit somebody in the head, and this is like, well, hold on, what, like, just because you didn't get your way or because that person didn't do what you wanted them to do, it's like, that's not a reason to go hit them in the head, generally speaking, again, not outlier behavior would always be that. But so the fact that we need practice in this kind of stuff, and that's helpful for us. And then thirdly, very beneficial is just the companionship, and then not just strength in numbers, strength in organization, but just something goes wrong in your life. It's nice to have other people that, and other obligations, things that I got to go do this or I got to go do that. And then when I'm there, I'm supported, and everything like that. So these connections, I think these are all things that I think are very easy for us to not think about, on a regular basis and so forth. But when put in front of us, it's like, oh yeah, I get it. I that's why this is this the way, or that's why, or that's the benefit from this. So things that it's like the wisdom of the past, so to speak, that you see when it comes out. So I did want to ask you though, like this information, like the Bowling Alone book that Putnam wrote and all this. And then also just a lot of it. He was speaking. He went to the White House under Bill Clinton and all this. Like this guy was somebody, and his information was getting out there back in the 90s, but the trends that he talked about have continued and even gotten worse. So do you make anything of that in particular? I mean, obviously the conditions, that matters. That was touched on a little bit, but just kind of, like the warning sign was 30 years ago, but we're still on the same road. The track ends, and all that. So what do you make of that?
No, I think, unfortunately, it's very sobering in the direction we're going with technology, because as I'm watching a documentary, I couldn't help but be reminded of the book we read for a show several months ago, earlier this year, called Amusing Ourselves to Death, which talked about the television being kind of a game changer in society and moving forward. And the idea was that eventually, like, the television is not going to move towards where culture was at the time of the television, as being invented and all that. That culture would follow the television and entertainment. And I can't help but think that it kind of manifests itself by having, not to get into, political stuff, right? But we had Hulk Hogan introducing, the next president of the United States at a convention. And I just felt like, yeah, that's like the ultimate meld of entertainment and politics, for example. And now here we are post the 90s. We began to have environments that were created in our society from due to technology that allowed us to become more isolated. And we discussed it. By the early 2000s, everybody had a laptop, and then it became an iPad by 2010, and it was Facebook and Instagram and YouTube, and the ability to really silo oneself and kind of have a world curated for you that feels good in one way, but then we noticed the offshoot once the studies started coming out by, let's say, the late 2010s in the recent years, the amount of depression, the rise in suicides, the rise in drug abuse, the whole psychological issues of fear of missing out, and everybody showing their best selves online. So, the person looking at it feels depressed because they feel that their life is not going anywhere when they're seeing everyone else on vacation and driving nice cars. So I think that what we've walked ourselves into unintentionally with this technology is just maybe a whole new way to watch ourselves and how we deal with all this and process it from an emotional and psychological level. And what we're able to look back to, your point you just made, is look back and say, oh, wow, all this stuff actually mattered. Just like going out to your local community, going bowling with a team and a group, going to your church, going to being part of a civic organization, showing up to your city's, council meeting and to see what they're doing in your city. All that stuff matters, and it not only matters for the cohesiveness of our culture and our society, but it appears to matter for us as individuals. Like, it makes us happy, makes us fulfilled, all that kind of stuff.
And the things that have replaced it, to your point, the things that have replaced it may seem like the same thing or seem similar. Social media may seem like you're in a group, but it's not fulfilling in the same way.
Right, it's artificial.
It's what we've learned.
It goes back to like aspartame versus sugar. It's not the real thing. You kind of know it, right? You taste a Diet Coke and it's just like, yeah, this ain't the same thing.
And you think you're getting ahead. You think you're like, oh, I've outsmarted my body, and it's like, oh no, this thing causes cancer. So but I think that, like, you raised a good point. In terms of how the recent technology or the developments in technology, not just recently, but just developments in technology. And to me, like, sometimes I think about this, and I've thought about this, just whether it be as a parent or just, as an adult. And it's always like, well, man, what did people used to do with themselves with all, like, we have all these, we have, go back cable TV, we got, this TV running 100 something channels all the time, or, and that's old, that shows my age, me saying that. But now it's like streaming. You can hop up, pop up and watch anything, at any point. YouTube, like, you can watch so much stuff. Like, what did people do before they had all these options to do stuff all the time, like, that are just, you can sit at home and do.
They sat around
like, they were doing stuff like this, bowling clubs and all that kind of stuff. And so these were forms. It wasn't just that people were like, you know what, I want to be a good citizen, let me go join this club. It's like, I don't have anything to do, so hey, let me go chill with these guys and drink
remember
beer.
To stat on picnics.
Exactly. And so that was the solution to, and it had other benefits, but that was a solution to a boredom problem that we just don't have anymore. And so, like, television, and it was specifically said in the documentary, television became the most popular form of entertainment, as opposed to a bowling league or, anything like that. So I think that the technology kind of replaced the need, or, filled the need, so to speak, with amusement. And it's not lost on me that the book we keep referencing was called Amusing Ourselves to Death, and now we're doing Join or Die. There's a lot of hyperbole with these things. At least I hope it's hyperbole. But see, the thing, but also what was mentioned
Oh, hold
which I
on. We
thought
are all
didn't
going
get
to die
enough
at some
time.
point. So just,
We're gonna,
just accept that.
it's not really an alternative ultimately,
Yeah.
but nonetheless, it's what you do while you're here. But it was mentioned briefly, and I wanted more on it, but I understand why they couldn't give us more on it. But also just in terms of the way society is organized and kind of the priorities of society, they were like, because people have to have time. And now I just went on and how we're using all our time on streaming and social media now. But nonetheless, also work schedule. If you're working 40, 50, 60 hours a week, both parents, you won't have the time to do this kind of stuff also, because by the time you do get home, you do want more passive entertainment. You do want to, as opposed to go, okay, let me go to this PTA meeting or let me go do this bowling club. It's like, yo, man, I'm tired. I've been working. I've been trafficked 4 hours a day. And then I got 50 hours to work. I'm not trying to go home. And then I got to go to this bowling club. That's going to have me out, yada, yada, yada. Then I got to get up the next morning. So we have to also make sure that we have time. And that's where, and it was, peppered in a couple of times, like, yo, the people who want a more hierarchical society and don't want active participation from the masses maybe want to move society to more of a scenario where people don't have time for this stuff, because it wasn't lost on them, the cyclical nature that the rise in group activity and the health of the democracy, it came at the end of the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age, where you have wealth concentration like now, and people working themselves to death, and not being able to get ahead because of the way the system is set up and the tax code, and the wealthy just get to get all the spoils. And then once people went a direction to get a handle on that and make sure that the spoils of society were shared more broadly, then you had this happen. And then now it's not a coincidence probably that as we go more into another Gilded Age, that this type of participation, is it a chicken or egg though? It's kind of the question.
No, it's a good one. And as you're saying, it makes me realize he had stats like the society's trust in government, for example. So like you say, he found that the inflection point was 1960 when trust started to go down. And by the early 2000s, it had really cratered to below 25%. So you're right. When kind of in the New Deal era, let's say from the 30s to the 60s, the trust was a lot higher, like 75% of the public trusted the government. And so I just think that, because there's a lot I know that we won't get into. I'd recommend everyone watch the documentary, not only for what we're talking about, but like his studies.
Yeah, we're trying to increase awareness. We're not doing like a book report where you can be like, okay, yeah, now I feel like I've seen it. Like, no, we're just we're putting it out there. But we got to get to the part about his studies in Italy, though. But go ahead. No,
but that's what I was going to get at is the studies. That's actually where I was going. The studies in Italy were very interesting. And that's what I mean. We're not going to be able to break down each study, and we don't have obviously the ability to show you the charts he showed and all that. But just the idea that, so he went to Italy in, it seems like the 1970s, I think. And
let me set it up real quick.
Go ahead.
Like, so what Italy did, like he's a researcher. He's trying to study stuff. So what Italy did in this time period was they changed their government system to distribute power from Rome, from the nation's capital, to send more power to the individual provinces around the country. And then not all power. It's still a nation, but then they wanted more, kind of like what we have with federalism here, where they had more power in the states as well. And so each state, though, was then going to set up and, how they were going to do their voting and all that. Like they had all their different ways of doing things. So he looked at that as like a lab, basically, and said, okay, well, I can look at basically based on the characteristics of these states, how good are they at producing democratic outcomes and having a healthy democratic system, or how good are they from keeping corruption out and things like that. And so he went and moved there to study this, because he saw this kind of breaking apart. And I shouldn't term it as that, this kind of redistribution of power as an opportunity to see how different factors, he was looking at things like education, wealth, all that kind of stuff, how that stuff would matter in the functioning of the democratic approach to the government, to the government.
Yeah, and so and I appreciate the setup, because it's very important. I would have forgotten to say that early part about the fact that the country of Italy made a decision. And you're right. That's what he said. That will be his petri dish on this, because like all these different, I was going to say fiefdoms, but municipalities, the more modern way. That they're getting all this at the same time. So,
and they all have different characteristics, about them inherently.
And basically, that's what really came. That's why I said, to watch the documentary, you'll get more of also the visuals on some of the stuff, the stats. But basically, it came down to those with a higher social capital, to your point, were more horizontal, more democratic, things like that. The ones with less social capital, less people out there mingling and interacting, ended up being more vertical, being more authoritarian, top down. And once a place was authoritarian for a certain period of time, then the public became apathetic and kind of felt like, well, what's the point of participating? We can't do anything anyway. So it's, and again, this is what I'm saying. It's fascinating, all this research, just in general, because it's almost like with the, just to go on a huge tangent here, but you'll get it when I come back. Like the Hubble telescope, right? Sorry, the James Webb telescope. Let me say the newer one.
Yeah, you're showing your age, man.
Yeah, I am showing my age. The Hubble used to be new, but the James Webb telescope, because of its ability to observe the universe in a different way than we've ever been able to, is now having us kind of reinterpret actually the way we understood potentially things like the Big Bang and all that. And I think that the ability for us as humanity now and to research, kind of things that have happened along the way, and to look back and say, what is actually important in terms of how we tick as human beings? And I think, and one thing that they did allude to in the documentary that goes along with what I'm saying is how academia spent so much time, especially early to mid 20th century, focusing on things like IQ, which of course are important. I'm not going to diminish the importance of trying to make sure that, measure people's intelligence levels. But this idea that we said, okay, well, we got to then replicate then how to teach to people with the very high IQs, because they're going to make society better, and we want it to be like that. But what happens is, just because you're very smart as an engineer or a doctor, again, doesn't mean that you're empathetic, doesn't mean you're creative, doesn't mean a lot of things. And so, again, this social capital to me is like that part of our discussion in our society and how we think it should be made up that we totally missed. I don't think we forgot it. I just think we didn't really appreciate that it existed in that way until someone like him.
I think there's evidence that we did. I think there was evidence that we did. And I'll say this
before I get into my... Well, let me throw something at you.
Let me throw something at you. The reason I think there's evidence that there was an understanding that existed in certain parts of society, but it's something that's forgotten now. And by the way, this is the argument that the real conservatives make, is just that, hey, if you change things too fast, you're not always going to be aware of all of the things under the surface on why things work the way that they work right now. So just be careful. I'm not talking reactionary politics that we see today, but just the true conservatives. It's like, hey, status quo, let's just have a little difference towards that. This is the basis of that. But the reason I came away, I was first like, oh man, this is knowledge that humanity might not have had before. But I think segregation and the zeal that people pursued segregation suggests that at least they knew, for example, segregationists knew that people intermingling together, people being a part of the same groups, because remember, they're people at that time, we can't have race mixing, and not and they were adamant about this in ways that now might seem like, geez, what's the big deal, but it's like, oh, that if you have this, if people start interacting together and start doing stuff together, then they're going to start bonding together and start seeing commonality in one another and not be. It's easy to turn to hate one another.
We could translate that into the hostility against DEI today, right? The same. You're right.
Possibly,
because people recognize that. Yeah.
I'm just saying directly, though, the hostility towards the idea of race mixing that we saw, in the past, I think suggests that they understood that interaction and social groups and people interacting together would bring people together, because their goal, the people, they were trying to keep people from coming together. So, again, when your enemy or the person who you're against, your adversary takes something and makes that very important to accomplish their goal, then you usually might want to look at that and say, okay, well, they must think that would be helpful to my goal, but all right. So, but that was a caveat. I just want to
divide and conquer. Yeah, you're right.
For sure. I thought the concept of generalized reciprocity was very important with this. And that was something like, once they got all this information and they distilled it all down and came on that. But that is basically is that when you have these groups and people know each other and all that kind of stuff, a lot of times with people, it's like, okay, well, I know somebody, I'm not going to screw them over, because then when they have a chance to screw me over, they'll screw me over. And basically, with a large amount of community engagement, what he has observed is that you'll have that concept expand to the whole community. It's like, well, I don't want to screw over people in my community because they probably are part of some group that'll know somebody. And then I'm going to have this whole enemy, these group of people that are like, oh, that know I screwed this person over and they're going to treat me different. So I just better be cool, generally speaking, towards everybody around me because, like any of these people could be a part of some group that then everybody's going to be side-eyeing me. So that to me was significant because the freeloader problem is a problem that all societies have to try to deal with. And so that kind of solves the freeloader problem in a way that isn't like oppressive. It's just like, you're creating these high expectations and everybody feels it internally and wants to be their best self because they never know kind of who's watching, so to speak. But the going back to the Italy piece, the uncivic areas where corruption is the norm, I've always wondered, and I'm gonna kick it back after this, and because we want to get the final thoughts, but I've always wondered why in certain parts of the world or country, or even now, like why are people categorically not opposed to corruption or self-dealing? Like, hey, I'm gonna, I control the government, and I'm gonna use the government to pay myself all this money. And it's like, well, hold up, I've never understood why people aren't categorically opposed to that. Now, people always call it out when somebody they disagree with does it, but I'm saying categorically, meaning you call it out even when somebody you agree with does it. Like, yo, man, we can't have that. And this was the answer to me, because it's like, okay, once you have these areas without the social and the community engagement, and then they become, as you pointed out, more hierarchical and everything like that, and more removed from the levers of power, where it's just like, it doesn't matter what I do. I'm just going to, that helped me understand that apathy on why we can see, we see it now. Like, it's like, wow, we're getting all these systems set up that are pure self-dealing systems. And nobody's, or a lot of people aren't like, hey, we can't have all these people that control the levers of the money, then also having all these government contracts. Like, we can't do that. But I see now how that happens. So, but just any final thoughts that you want to wrap out, or said anything before we get out of here?
I mean, the one area I also thought was very interesting was when he alluded to the idea of like social mobility really is reflected on whether people of lower income, middle income, and higher income actually are able to assimilate within the culture or not.
Yeah.
And that for me was actually interesting because anecdotally, I lived in Australia for almost 5 years in the 90s. And even last time I went back was 2015. And it just, going back in 2015 after so many years, because I probably hadn't been back since '09, I think, and having just lived in the United States and being American, was an interesting reminder because my friend lived in a very nice neighborhood who I was staying with in 2015 that was 1 mile from the Sydney Harbor Bridge, which is, nice part of town. At the time, his house was valued around $3 million in 2015. And I would go walking every day, and literally right up the street was a public housing building that was about, 20 stories high, maybe 15 stories. And I remember talking to him about it because it just stood out to me that, wow, there's like basically a project building in the middle of this nice neighborhood. Yeah. And so I was just talking to him like, hey man, like I forgot that this, Australia did it like this, where they had public housing and a mix of regular kind of suburban neighborhoods and stuff. And I was like, do you guys ever get worried about like, crime and all that? And he was like, nah, man, what are you talking about? What, long story short, just for now, what I realized and learned and was reminded in dealing with, just over there is interesting. The people in that housing project and the public housing raised their standards. They didn't have graffiti on the wall. They didn't have broken windows and all that. They kind of raised themselves to behave like the suburban community. And what I found is the people in the houses next to the building, they weren't scared of poor people. And it reminded me that no, in the United States, the word you use, segregation, is correct. And here, not necessarily and racial segregation.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, we have class segregation. And you have highways like we're down here in South Florida, I-95, where we just drive from Fort Lauderdale to Miami. There's walls at the side of each of the highway, so we can't even see the neighborhoods on the street. So I can go from my nice neighborhood in Fort Lauderdale, drive down to Miami, I never really touch the lower class community and all that if I don't want to, right? I got to actually get off the highway, go to a gas station in the ghetto and say, okay, now I see how other people live. And so that to me was a reminder in there too that, and I think we're very far away from ever trying something like that in the United States because culturally we're just not, we are scared of the other in this country.
We got to join more groups, man, apparently.
Yeah. But that's what I mean. A lot of that is class-based. And one of the things I always felt that could help us, but again, I'm not president of the United States to suggest this, would be something like national service, like some countries do. Yeah. That if we had after high school at age 18, kids go into the military or Peace Corps, they got to serve the country somehow. Like you're saying, that would flatten at least starting a new generation where they all got to be in boot camp and the barracks and all that, whether you're rich, poor, black, white, whatever. Everybody's getting the kind of same experience, and they're getting a shared story about the nation, right? They're getting reinvigorated with patriotism. Yeah.
No, you're talking military, Peace Corps, but it could be broad. It could be, Habitat for Humanity. It could be like all types of things where we say all this stuff we need to do around the country. Like, we could do that. I mean, I think it's good, but that would solve problems, but it would also bring people together and see a common struggle more. I think that the economic point is an excellent point, though, because you hear that from time to time where people say, oh, we need mixed income kind of housing developments type of thing. And people are like, oh, no. Like people,
exactly.
people react to that. Like you're talking about you need to bring Martians in. But the point being is that, like places where they have a better handle on this, or they would, it looks like they have a better handle from a cohesion standpoint. That's the kinds of things they do. It's intentional to bring people, make sure people see humanity in each other and all that type of stuff. And I think that's the underlying point here is that as we go more isolated and alone, and then like you said, you can go from home to some high rise downtown Miami, and it's like I don't see any of the outside. Like like I might as well be on a train of one where everything blacked out. I don't see what's going on at all. Like that kind of isolation ultimately, and if when I say it like this, it sounds like, of course, but that kind of isolation makes it difficult for us to build something collectively, And so yeah, I mean, I think that for that reason and for all the reasons, I mean, it's definitely something that's worth checking out. The documentary, and so and our goal here again wasn't to tell you all about it, but more so some pieces to kind of sprinkle in here, some things that stood out. But definitely, we would recommend check it out. Also, check us out. Next time we come out or anything like that, subscribe to the podcast, rate it, review it, tell us what you think, send it to a friend. Until next time, I'm James Keys.
I'm Tunde Ogunlana.
All right, we'll talk to you soon.